Hey guys, tonight we step off a rattling, frost-covered train into the heart of a Soviet Gulag, where the air bites your skin like 1,000 tiny knives and the sky is a grey slab of despair. It's the 1930s, and you're in Siberia's frozen nowhere, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers that loom like silent judges. The ground crunches under your thin boots, and the wind carries a chorus of distant shouts and clanging metal. You're a prisoner now, maybe a political dissident, maybe just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and this camp is your new reality. Spoiler, you probably won't survive this without a strong will and a stronger stomach for suffering. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time. I'm curious where you're drifting off from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're herded off the train with a crowd of gaunt faces, your breath fogging in the sub-zero air as guards bark orders in Russian you barely understand. Your coat's threadbare, your hands already numb, and the weight of your sentence 5 years, 10, maybe more as it's heavy on your shoulders. The Gulag, a network of labor camps stretching across the Soviet Union, was Stalin's brutal answer to dissent, crime, or just bad luck. Mainstream history tells us that from the 1930s to the 1950s, millions were sent to these camps, forced to work in mines, forests, or factories under conditions that crushed body and soul. You're one of them now, shuffling toward a gate where a guard checks names off a list, his rifle glinting under the weak sunlight. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some prisoners arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs, but others clutched odd keepsakes like a single spoon or a tattered photo smuggled past searches, as if those scraps could anchor them to a life left behind. You pat your pocket, feeling a worn button from your old coat, and wonder if it'll mean anything here. Historians still argue whether the Gulag was primarily a tool for economic production or a machine for political repression, with some saying it built Soviet infrastructure and others insisting it was designed to break spirits. You're not sure which is true, but the barbed wire and the guard's cold stare lean toward the latter. You're marched toward a cluster of low wooden barracks, their roofs sagging under snow. The camp's a sprawling maze of fences, work zones, and watchtowers, with a faint smell of smoke and unwashed bodies hanging in the air. Your first task is to survive the cold, which feels like it's clawing into your bones. The guards don't care if you're freezing, they just want you moving. You're handed a number, sewn onto your jacket like a brand, and told to line up for inspection. The other prisonersmen and women, young and old, look as tired as you feel, their eyes hollow but sharp, like they're already calculating how to make it through the day. Speaking of making it, here's a joke. Why did the Gulag prisoner keep his button? Because it was the only thing holding his hope together. You smirk, but the guy next to you doesn't notice. He's too busy rubbing his hands to keep warm. You're starting to see how this place works. Every moment's a test, every step a gamble. The guards shout for you to move faster, and you trudge toward the barracks, your boots sinking into the snow. Joking aside, if this welcome is any hint of what's coming, you're already missing that train, rickety as it was. You're not sure what's next, but the weight in your chest says it won't be easy. You're still shivering from the biting Siberian cold, your boots crunching through snow as you're herded toward a clearing in the Gulag camp. It's barely dawn, the sky a dull grey smear, and the guards are already barking orders, their breath fogging in the icy air. You line up shoulder to shoulder with other prisoners, a ragged mix of hollow-eyed men and women, for the morning roll-colour brutal ritual that kicks off every day in this frozen hell. The wind cuts through your thin jacket, and you're trying not to think about how your toes stopped feeling anything an hour ago. The guard's clipboard is the only sound louder than the chattering of teeth, and you're about to learn how this daily head count sets the tone for survival in the Gulag. Morning roll calls were a cornerstone of Gulag life, designed to maintain control and crush any hope of rebellion. Mainstream history tells us that in the 1930s and 1940s, prisoners were counted twice daily, morning and evening, to ensure no one escaped or died unnoticed. You stand there, stiff as a board, while a guard shouts names in a monotone, his rifle slung over his shoulder like a casual threat. If someone's missing, the whole camp waits, sometimes for hours, in temperatures that could freeze your eyelashes. You glance at the guy next to you, his face red from the cold, and wonder if he'll make it through the count without collapsing. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some prisoners claim they saw guards miscount on purpose, dragging out roll call to punish everyone for one person's absence like a cruel game of freeze tag. You catch a guard eyeing the line with a smirk, and you're pretty sure he's counting you twice just to mess with you. Historians still argue whether roll calls were purely administrative or a deliberate tool to break prisoners' spirits, with some saying they were about order and others insisting they were psychological torture. Your aching legs, standing in knee-deep snow, lean toward torture. The camp's a bleak sprawl around you, with barracks, work zones, and watchtowers fading into the morning mist. You're trying to focus, but the cold's making your brain sluggish, like that coffee from the Wild West saloon you imagined a while back, except here. There's no coffee, just frost and fear. The guards don't care if you're shivering, they just want the numbers to match. You notice a woman in the line, clutching her coat, her fingers blue, and you wonder what she did to end up here, probably no more than you did. The roll call drags on, names slurred through the guard's chapped lips, and you're starting to lose feeling in your hands. Speaking of hands, here's a joke. Why did the prisoner hate roll call? Because it was the only time he couldn't hide his frostbite. You smirk, but the guy next to you doesn't notice. He's too busy stomping his feet to keep warm. The roll call's not just about counting heads. It's about reminding you who's in charge. You're starting to see the rhythm of this place stand. Wait, suffer, repeat. The guard finally finishes, shouting something about work assignments, and you're shuffled toward a shed for tools. Joking aside, if standing in the cold is the warm-up, you're not sure you're ready for the main event. Your stomach's already growling, and you're hoping for something to eat before the day's labor begins. You trudge forward, the snow swallowing your steps, and brace for whatever this camp throws at you next. You're still shivering from the morning roll call, your breath fogging in the icy air as you shuffle toward a long, low building that smells faintly of mold and despair. The Gulag's dawn light is weak, barely cutting through the grey haze, and the guards herd you like cattle toward the mess hall, if you can call it that. Inside, the air's damp, the wooden benches splintered, and a line of prisoners clutches tin bowls, waiting for their meagre breakfast. You grab a bowl, its edges dented, and join the queue, your stomach growling louder than the guards' shouts outside. The smell of something watery and vaguely grainy hits you, and you're about to discover how food in the Gulag was both a lifeline and a punishment, doled out in portions that barely kept you alive. Breakfast in the Gulag was a grim affair, designed to sustain labor, not comfort. Mainstream history tells us that in the 1930s and 1940s, prisoners were fed a diet of thin gruel or porridge, often made from barley, oats, or whatever grain was cheapest. You reach the front of the line, and a cook's face as sour as the food ladles a greyish sludge into your bowl. It's watery, with a texture like wet sand and a taste that's more punishment than nourishment. You spoon it up, trying not to notice the tiny specks that might be bugs or just grit. It's cold by the time you sit, but you're too hungry to care. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some prisoners swore they found fish bones or potato peels in their gruel, rare treats that felt like winning the lottery in a place where hunger was a constant companion. You poke at a suspicious lump in your bowl, hoping it's a potato but not holding your breath. Historians still argue whether the Gulag's starvation rations were deliberate cruelty or just logistical failure, with some saying they were meant to weaken prisoners and others claiming supply shortages left no choice. You take another spoonful, and cruelty feels like a safe bet nobody makes food this bad by accident. The mess hall's a grim scene, with prisoners hunched over their bowls, eating in silence like it's a race against the guards' whistles. The benches are packed, and you're shoulder to shoulder with a guy who smells like he hasn't bathed since Moscow. The gruel's barely enough to fill your stomach, let alone fuel the day's work. But you scrape every drop, remembering that chili from the Wild West saloon now that had some kick. Unlike this tasteless slop, the guards pace the room, watching for anyone who lingers too long. You're starting to see why food was a weapon here too little, and you weaken too much, and you might get ideas about fighting back. Speaking of fighting, here's a joke. Why did the gruel go untouched? Because even the rats knew it was a lost cause. You smirk, but the woman next to you doesn't notice she's too busy licking her spoon clean. You're getting the hang of this place. Eat fast, don't ask questions, and hope for better tomorrow. The gruel's gone, leaving a faint ache in your gut, and the guards are already shouting for you to move out. Work awaits, and you're not sure how you'll swing a pickaxe on this pathetic meal. Joking aside, if this breakfast is supposed to keep you going, you're already dreaming of those pickles from that saloon days ago. You stand, bowl in hand, and trudge toward the door, the cold air hitting you like a slap as you brace for the labor ahead. You're still reeling from that watery gruel, its faint warmth already fading as you trudge through the snow toward a worksite, the gulag's icy grip tightening around you. The skies are heavy grey, and the air smells of pine and frozen earth, undercut by the sweat of the prisoners shuffling beside you. A guard hands you a pickaxe, its handle worn smooth by countless hands, and points you toward a quarry where jagged rocks jut from the ground like broken teeth. You're about to start the back-breaking labour that defines a prisoner's day in the Gulag, swinging tools under the watchful eyes of guards who'd rather shoot than shout. Your muscles ache just looking at the quarry, and you're wondering how that pathetic breakfast is supposed to fuel this grind. Forced labour was the backbone of the Gulag system, designed to extract every ounce of strength for Soviet projects. Mainstream history tells us that in the 1930s and 1940s, prisoners built roads, mined coal, or quarried stone, often in brutal conditions that left many broken or worse. You swing the pickaxe, and it bites into the frozen ground with a dull thud, sending a jolt up your arms. The rock's stubborn, like it's fighting back, and the cold makes your fingers fumble on the handle. You're surrounded by other prisoners, their faces grim, hacking away in a rhythm that's more survival than skill. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some prisoners carved tiny initials into their tools, a quiet act of defiance to claim something in a place that stripped you of everything. You notice a faint V scratched into your pickaxe's handle, and you wonder who left it. Some guy named Victor, maybe, or just someone dreaming of victory. Historians still argue whether Gulag labor was about economic gain or pure punishment, with some saying it fueled Stalin's industrial dreams, and others insisting it was meant to crush dissent. Your aching back says punishment's winning, but you keep swinging, because stopping means trouble. The quarry's a bleak expanse, dotted with prisoners and piles of broken stone, the air filled with the clink of tools and the occasional curse. You're thinking about that Wild West saloon Chileno that had some fire to keep you going. Unlike the gruel still sitting like a stone in your gut, the guards pace the perimeter, their boots crunching, their rifles glinting in the weak light. You're starting to understand the rhythm of work here. Swing, lift, repeat, until your body screams or the whistle blows. A guy next to you coughs, his breath ragged, and you wonder if he'll make it through the shift. Nobody talks, much too cold, too tired, too wary of the guards. Speaking of guards, here's a joke. Why did the pickaxe hate the Gulag? Because it was tired of breaking rocks and spirits. You smirk, but the prisoner next to you doesn't notice he's too focused on not dropping his tool. The work's relentless, and the cold's making it worse, seeping into your bones like it's got a personal grudge. You're starting to see why labor was the Gulag's heartbeat. At it kept you too exhausted to think, too broken to fight. The whistle finally blows, signaling a break, and you lean on your pickaxe, panting. Lunch is next, if you can call it that, and you're already bracing for another round of slop. Joking aside, if that gruel was breakfast, you're not holding out hope for a gourmet lunch. You trudge toward the mess area, the quarry's dust clinging to your coat, ready for whatever this camp serves up next. You're still aching from the quarry. Your hands roar from gripping that pickaxe as you trudge through the snow toward a makeshift mess area, a patch of cleared ground ringed by barbed wire. The Gulag's midday sun is a weak glow, barely warming the air, which smells of damp wool and distant smoke. You join a line of prisoners, all clutching tin bowls, their faces etched with exhaustion and hunger. A guard watches, his rifle slung low, as a cook ladles out lunch, a thin, greyish soup that looks like it's been simmering since Stalin took power. You hold out your bowl, feeling the faint heat through the metal, and brace for another meal that's more about survival than satisfaction. This is lunch in the Gulag, a fleeting break in the endless labour, and you're about to learn how even a spoonful of broth was a battle won. Lunch was a critical moment in the Gulag day, a brief pause to refuel for more grueling work. Mainstream history tells us that in the 1930s and 1940s, Gulag prisoners were given a midday ration, usually a watery soup made from scraps cabbage, potato peels, or whatever didn't rot on the supply sled. You take a sip, and it's bland, with a faint cabbage tang and a texture like diluted regret. There's a chewy bit that might be meat, or maybe just gristle, but you're too hungry to care. You huddle with other prisoners, sitting on logs or the frozen ground, trying to eat before the cold turns your soup to slush. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some prisoners swore they found tiny fish heads in their soup, a rare protein boost that felt like striking gold in this barren place. You poke at a suspicious lump in your bowl, half hoping it's a fish but not betting on it. Historians still argue whether these meagre lunches were meant to sustain workers or just keep them barely alive, with some saying they were calculated to maximize labor output, and others insisting they were a tool to weaken resistance. Your empty stomach leans toward the latter as you scrape the bowl clean, wishing for that Wild West Chili's kick to make this bearable. The mess area's a grim scene, with prisoners eating in silence, their spoons clinking like a tired metronome. You're shoulder to shoulder, with a guy whose cough sounds like it's been following him since breakfast. The guards loom nearby, ensuring nobody lingers or shares foods too precious for that. You're starting to see how meals were a control tactic here, just enough to keep you working, not enough to give you strength to rebel. The soup's gone in minutes, leaving a faint warmth that's already fading in the Siberian chill. You think back to that saloon's pickles, their sharp crunch a distant dream compared to this watery slop. Speaking of slop, here's a joke. Why did the Gulag soup taste so sad? Because it was made with decaf. You smirk, but the woman next to you doesn't notice. She's too busy licking her bowl for every last drop. The whistle blows, signalling the end of the break, and you're herded back toward the quarry, your legs heavy, your stomach still growling. Lunch was less a meal and more a tease, a reminder of what food could be in a different life. Joking aside, if this soup's supposed to carry you through the afternoon, you're already missing that morning gruel, pathetic as it was. You grip your pickaxe again, the cold biting your fingers, and brace for the next round of labor in this frozen, unforgiving camp. You're back in the quarry, the pickaxe's weight dragging at your arms as you trudge through the snow, the faint warmth of that watery soup already a distant memory. The Gulag's air is sharp with pine and frost, and the clatter of tools mixes with the low grumble of prisoners too tired to talk. You're surrounded by a mix of faces, some hardened, some broken, each navigating the camp's unwritten rules of survival. This is the social hierarchy of the Gulag, a brutal pecking order where criminals, political prisoners, and everyone in between jostle for scraps, status, or just a chance to make it through the day. You're learning fast that who you stand next to could mean the difference between a crust of bread or a fist to the face. The Gulag's social structure was a complex web, shaped by desperation and power. Mainstream history tells us that in the 1930s and 1940s, camps were divided between politicals, intellectuals, dissidents, or anyone labeled an enemy of the state, and criminals, often thieves or gangsters who ruled through intimidation. You're a political, you think, judging by the way a burly guy with a scarred face eyes your boots like they're his next prize. He's one of the Urki, the criminal elite, who often got better rations or lighter work by cozying up to guards. You keep your head down, trying not to draw attention, but you're already sizing up who's friend, foe, or just trying to survive like you. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some criminals ran makeshift courts in the barracks, settling disputes with their own brutal justice, like a twisted version of a neighborhood watch. You overhear a guy whispering about a thief who lost his tobacco ration for stealing a spoon, judge, jury, and fist all in one night. Historians still argue whether this hierarchy helped maintain order or just deepened the camp's misery, with some saying it gave prisoners a sense of control and others claiming it turned them against each other for the guards' benefit. You're leaning toward misery as you dodge the scarred guy's glare, clutching your pickaxe like it's your only ally. The quarry's a chaotic mix of prisoners, some swinging tools with grim focus, others slacking when the guards aren't looking. You notice a thin man, probably a political like you, muttering to himself as he works, maybe a professor or a poet, now reduced to breaking rocks. The criminals, meanwhile, strut like they own the place, barking orders at weaker prisoners to carry their load. You're starting to see how this hierarchy works. The strong prey on the weak, and the weak learn to blend in or barter. You think back to that Wild West saloon, where a pickle or a shot of moonshine could buy you a friend here. A crust of bread might cost you your dignity. Speaking of dignity, here's a joke. Why did the prisoner avoid the criminals? Because he didn't want to trade his soul for a soup spoon. You smirk, but the guy next to you doesn't notice. He's too busy dodging a rock kicked his way by an urki. The guards don't care about the pecking order, as long as the work gets done, their rifles glinting in the weak sunlight. You're learning to navigate this world, keeping your eyes low, but your senses sharp. The day's dragging on, and the cold seeping deeper into your bones. Joking aside, if surviving the quarry means surviving this hierarchy, you're already missing that sad lunch soup. You swing your pickaxe, the rhythm grounding you, and brace for whatever this camp's social jungle throws at you next. You're still in the quarry, your arms screaming from swinging that pickaxe, the gulag's icy wind clawing at your face like it's got a personal grudge. The air smells of damp earth and pine, mixed with the sweat of prisoners hacking away at stubborn rock. You're handed a new tool now, a rusty saw, its teeth dull, as a bad liand pointed toward a forest edge where trees stand like silent witnesses. You're about to dive into another grueling task, cutting timber in the frozen wilderness, and learn how the Gulag's shoddy tools and relentless demands took a toll on body and soul. Your hands, already raw from the quarry, fumble with the saw, and you're wondering how much more this day can ask of you. Forced labor in the Gulag wasn't just about work. It was about breaking you down. Mainstream history tells us that in the 1930s and 1940s, prisoners felled trees, dug canals, or mined ore with tools that were often broken or barely functional, pushing human endurance to its limits. You start sawing, the blade catching on the frozen bark, each stroke a battle against the wood and your own exhaustion. The tree's stubborn, like it knows you're no lumberjack, and the saw's dull edge makes it feel like you're cutting with a butter knife. Your breath fogs in the air, and your back's already aching like you've been at it for hours. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some prisoners swore they used their saws to carve tiny figurines during rare breaks, trading them for extra bread or a moment's favor with a guard. You notice a faint carving on a nearby stump, a crude bird, maybe left by someone who needed to prove they still had a spark of creativity. Historians still argue whether Gulag labor was meant to build Soviet infrastructure or simply destroy prisoners, with some saying it powered Stalin's economy and others insisting it was punishment dressed as productivity. Your burning muscles scream punishment as you keep sawing, the wood barely giving way. The forest around you is a grim expanse, dotted with prisoners and stumps, the air filled with the rasp of saws and the occasional crack of a falling tree. You're thinking about that Wild West saloon's chileno that had some heat to keep you going, unlike the watery soup still sitting heavy in your gut. The guards patrol the edges, shouting at anyone who slows down, their rifles glinting like a constant threat. You're starting to see the pattern here. Work until you drop, then work some more. A guy nearby curses as his saw jams, and you wonder if he'll make it through the shift without losing a finger of his temper. Speaking of tempers, here's a joke. Why did the saw hate the Gulag? Because it was tired of cutting corners for nothing. You smirk, but the prisoner next to you doesn't notice he's too busy wrestling his own tool. The cold's making everything harder. Your fingers stiff, and your saw slipping. You're learning that tools here weren't just bad, they were a test, like everything else in this camp. The whistle blows, signaling the end of the shift, and you lean against the tree, panting. Evening's coming, and with it, another meager meal. Joking aside, if this saw's the best the Gulag's got, you're already dreading dinner's disappointment. You trudge back toward the camp, the forest's chill clinging to your coat, ready for whatever slop awaits. You're trudging back from the forest, the saw's weight still heavy in your hands, your muscles screaming as the Gulag's icy dusk settles around you. The air smells of pine sap and frost, undercut by the sour tang of unwashed bodies as you join a line of prisoners shuffling toward the mess hall. The weak glow of oil lamps spills from the building, and inside, the air's damp and heavy, like breathing through a wet rag. You clutch your tin bowl, its dense familiar now, and wait for the evening meal ritual as grim as the morning's gruel. The cook ladles out a chunk of stale bread and a watery broth that smells like despair with a hint of cabbage. You're about to choke down this meager dinner, learning how food in the Gulag wasn't just scarce but a tool of control, designed to keep you hungry and obedient. Evening meals were the last chance to eat in a Gulag day, barely enough to sustain you through the night. Mainstream history tells us that in the 1930s and 1940s, dinner rations often consisted of a small piece of black bread, maybe 300 grams, if you were lucky paired with a thin soup or porridge. You tear into the bread, its crust hard as a rock, and its insides dense, like chewing on a grudge. The broth's no better, a lukewarm mix of potato scraps and mystery bits that might be barley or just dirt. You sip it, trying not to wince, and notice it's colder than that Wild West saloon's coffee without the kick. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some prisoners called their bread Gulag gold, hoarding crumbs to trade for tobacco or a better bunk, turning a stale loaf into camp currency. You catch a guy slipping a piece into his pocket, probably planning to barter later, and you're tempted to do the same. Historians still argue whether these rations were meant to barely sustain life or deliberately starve prisoners, with some saying they were calculated for minimal survival and others claiming they were a slow form of punishment. Your growling stomach votes for punishment as you force down another bite of bread, its grit sticking to your teeth. The mess hall's a quiet misery, with prisoners hunched over their bowls, eating like it's a race against the guards' whistles. You're squeezed between a coughing woman and a silent man, their faces etched with the day's labour. The guards pace the room, ensuring nobody lingers or shares every crumb's a battle here. You're starting to see how dinner was another way to keep you in line. Just enough to keep you working. Not enough to give you hope. You think back to that saloon's chili, its fiery burn a distant dream compared to this tasteless slop. The bread's gone too fast, and the broth doesn't fill the void, leaving you hungry for something more: food, freedom, anything. Speaking of hunger, here's a joke. Why did the Gulag bread taste so bitter? Because it was baked with decaf and disappointment. You smirk, but the guy next to you doesn't notice. He's too busy scraping his bowl. The whistle blows, signalling the end of dinner, and you're herded toward the barracks, the cold hitting you like a slap as you step outside. Joking aside, if this meal's supposed to carry you through the night, you're already missing that Quarry's rhythmit at least kept you warm. You clutch your empty bowl, the snow crunching under your boots, and brace for the next challenge. Surviving the night in a barrack that's more prison than home, you're shuffling through the snow, the empty bowl from that miserable dinner still clutched in your frozen hands as the Gulag's darkness closes in. The air's sharp with frost and the faint smell of smoke from the camp stoves barely cutting through the chill. You're herded toward a low wooden barrack, its walls warped and sagging under the weight of snow. Inside, the air's thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, damp wood, and something sour you don't want to name. You find a bunker narrow, splintered slab, crammed among dozens covered with a thin blanket that's more holes than fabric. You collapse onto it, feeling the bite of bedbugs and lice already plotting their attack. This is sleep in the Gulag, a battle against filth, cold, and the constant threat of theft, or worse in these cramped, miserable quarters. Barracks were the grim heart of Gulag life, where prisoners sought rest but found little. Mainstream history tells us that in the 1930s and 1940s, Gulag barracks were overcrowded, poorly built, and infested with pests. housing dozens or even hundreds in spaces meant for far fewer. You shift on the bunk, the wood creaking under you, and feel something crawl across your arm. The blanket's useless against the cold seeping through the walls, and the snores, coughs, and mutters of other prisoners fill the air like a chorus of despair. You're surrounded by strangers, some criminals, some politicals, all fighting for space and survival. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some prisoners carved tiny notches into their bunk frames, marking days, or just proving they were still here, like graffiti for the hopeless. You notice a faint scratch on your bunker-crewed star, maybe, and wonder who left it, clinging to some shred of identity. Historians still argue whether barracks fostered camaraderie or bred conflict, with some saying shared suffering built bonds, and others claiming the cramped conditions turned prisoners against each other. Your aching body, pressed against a snoring neighbour, leans toward conflict as you swat at another bug. The barracks a dim, chaotic world, lit by a single flickering lamp that casts shadows like ghosts on the walls. You're thinking about that Wild West saloon's oysters. Those slimy luxuries feel like a fever dream compared to this lice-infested reality. The air's so cold you can see your breath, and the thin blanket's no match for the draft. You're starting to see why sleep was a luxury here. Between the bugs, the cold, and the guy next to you muttering about stolen bread, rest feels like a cruel joke. The guards don't bother patrolling inside. They know the prisoners are too tired or scared to cause trouble. Speaking of trouble, here's a joke. Why did the bedbug love the Gulag? Because it had an all-you-can-eat buffet. You smirk, but the woman on the next bunk doesn't notice. She's too busy wrapping her coat tighter against the cold. You're learning the barracks rules. Keep your stuff close. Don't trust anyone, and pray the bugs pick someone else tonight. The night stretches ahead, long and restless, and you're already dreading the morning roll call. Joking aside, if this bunk's supposed to be your refuge, you're starting to miss that quarry's rhythm, brutal as it was. You pull the blanket over your head, trying to block out the cold and the crawling, and brace for a night that's more survival than sleep. You're still curled on that lice-infested bunk, the barracks chill seeping into your bones as the faint snores and coughs of other prisoners fill the air. The Gulag's darkness is absolute outside, the only light a weak flicker from a lamp that's more shadow than glow. You're clutching that worn button from your old coat, the one you smuggled past the guards, and it's got you thinking about home, family, a warm bed, a life that feels like a dream now. You sit up, careful not to wake the guy next to you, and pull a scrap of paper from your pocket, a rare treasure in this place. You're about to scribble a letter, one of the few ways prisoners could cling to the outside world, and learn how these fleeting connections kept hope alive in the Gulag's endless grind. Letters were a lifeline for Gulag prisoners, though sending or receiving one was a rare privilege tightly controlled by camp authorities. Mainstream history tells us that in the 1930s and 1940s, prisoners were sometimes allowed to write or receive letters, often censored to ensure no complaints or secrets slipped through. You hunch over your paper, using a stub of pencil you traded a bread crust for, and start writing to someone, maybe a spouse, maybe a parent, your words careful, vague, to avoid the censor's pen. The barracks cold makes your fingers stiff, and the faint scratch of pencil on paper feels like a small rebellion against the silence. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some prisoners hid tiny messages in their letters, using code words or faint scratches under stamps to say what censors wouldn't allow, like a secret handshake in ink. You wonder if you could slip "I'm still here" into your note. But the thought of a guard ripping it up stops you. Historians still argue whether letters were a genuine outlet for prisoners or just another tool of control, with some saying they offered hope and others claiming they were dangled to keep inmates docile. You're shaking hands, struggling to write in the dim light, lean toward hope you need something to hold on to. The barracks a grim cocoon around you, with prisoners tossing in their sleep or muttering in the dark. You're thinking about that Wild West saloon's pickles, their sharp crunch, a world away from this paper-thin connection to home. Writing's hard, your words feel clumsy, and the cold's making your thoughts sluggish. You're not even sure if this letter will reach anyone, or if you'll get a reply before your sentence ends. The guards check mail irregularly, and some prisoners wait years for a word from outside. You're starting to see why letters were so precious. They were proof you weren't forgotten, even if the world seemed to have moved on. Speaking of moving on, here's a joke. Why did the Gulag letter take so long? Because it had to detour through the censor's bad mood. You smirk, but the guy on the next bunk doesn't notice he's snoring like he's dreaming of freedom. You finish your note, folding it carefully, and tuck it back in your pocket, hoping it'll make it out. The barrack's quiet now, save for the creak of bunks and the howl of wind outside. Joking aside, if this letter's your only link to the world, you're already missing that Quarry's rhythmit at least kept you moving. You lie back, the bunk splinters digging into you, and brace for another restless night, wondering if your words will ever find their way home. You're shivering in the dark, finally released from that freezing punishment cell, your body stiff and aching as you stumble back toward the barracks. The Gulag's night air bites at your face, carrying the faint smell of smoke and pine, and the snow crunches under your boots like a grim reminder of where you are. Inside the barrack, the air's thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and damp wood, but it's a palace compared to solitary. You're clutching a crust of bread, your last ration, saved from dinner, and notice a guy eyeing it like it's gold. He offers a needle, rusted but sharp, and you're about to dive into the Gulag's black market, where prisoners bartered scraps to survive. This underground economy was a lifeline, a way to trade crumbs of bread for a shred of hope in this brutal camp. The black market thrived in the Gulag, a hidden network of trades that kept prisoners going when rations weren't enough. Mainstream history tells us that in the 1930s and 1940s, prisoners swapped everything: food, tools, even favors with criminals often running the show, leveraging their status to control the flow of goods. You hesitate, then hand over the crust, taking the needle in return. Its weight, a small victory in your palm. You're thinking about stitching your torn coat, maybe trading it later for a bit of tobacco. The guy nods, disappearing into the barrack's shadows, and you're already wondering if you got the better dealer, if you'll regret it when hunger hits. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some prisoners traded luxuries like a single match or a scrap of newspaper, treating them like treasures in a place where nothing was guaranteed. You overhear a woman whispering about swapping a button for a spoonful of sugar, like it was a diamond. Historians still argue whether the black market gave prisoners agency or deepened their desperation, with some saying it fostered resilience and others claiming it turned survival into a ruthless game. Your empty stomach, missing that bread crust, leans toward desperation, but the needle's a start. Maybe you'll fix something, or trade up tomorrow. The barracks are dim chaos, with prisoners huddled in small groups, whispering deals or guarding their own stashes. You're thinking about that Wild West saloon's pickles; those were worth bartering for, unlike the sad soup you choked down earlier. The black market's risky. Guards crack down hard if they catch you, and a bad trade can leave you with nothing. You notice a criminal, a burly guy with a scar haggling over a pair of socks, his voice low but sharp. You're learning the rules: trade quietly, trust sparingly, and always watch your back. The needle's tucked in your pocket now, next to that button from home, and it feels like a tiny rebellion against the camp's grind. Speaking of rebellion, here's a joke. Why did the prisoner barter his bread? Because he wanted to be the richest guy in the poorhouse. You smirk, but the guy on the next bunk doesn't notice. He's too busy hiding a scrap of cloth under his blanket. The barracks quieting down, the day's labor weighing heavy on everyone. You're starting to see how trading kept hope alive, even if it meant gambling with what little you had. Joking aside, if this needle's your big score, you're already missing that crust of bread from last night's dinner. You settle onto your bunk, the lice waiting like old friends, and brace for another restless night, wondering what else you might trade to make it through this frozen hell. You're still lying on that splintered bunk, the faint hope of your letter tucked away, as the Gulag's icy night presses in, the barracks air thick with the stench of damp wood and unwashed bodies. The snores and coughs around you fade as a guard's boots crunch outside, followed by a sharp shout that makes your stomach twist. You've done something wrong. Maybe you lingered too long at dinner, or a guard just didn't like your face and now you're being yanked from the bunk, marched through the snow to a punishment cell. The cell's a dank, concrete box, barely big enough for you to stand, with walls that feel like they're closing in. You're about to learn the brutal consequences of breaking Gulag rules, where solitary confinement was a freezing, lonely hell meant to crush any spark of defiance. Punishment cells, known as isolators, were a grim reality in the Gulag, used to discipline prisoners for infractions big or small. Mainstream history tells us that in the 1930s and 1940s, solitary confinement was a common penalty, with prisoners locked in tiny, unheated cells for days or weeks, often with reduced rations. You huddle in the corner, your breath fogging in the sub-zero air, the cold seeping through your thin coat like a knife. The walls are slick with frost, and there's no bunk, just a bare floor that feels like sleeping on an ice block. You're alone, except for the faint drip of water somewhere, each drop a reminder of time dragging on. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some prisoners claimed they sang to themselves in solitary to stay sane, their voices echoing off the walls like a private rebellion against the silence. You hum a tune something from home, maybe, but it's weak, swallowed by the cell's oppressive chill. Historians still argue whether punishment cells were effective discipline or pure sadism, with some saying they kept order and others insisting they were meant to break spirits entirely. Your shivering body, curled against the wall, votes for sadism. You're not sure how anyone comes out of this intact. The cell's darkness is suffocating, broken only by a sliver of light from a tiny, barred window high above. You're thinking about that Wild West saloon's moonshine, its fiery kick a far cry from this freezing void. The guards don't check on you. They just leave you to the cold and your thoughts, which are starting to spiral. You're replaying the day roll call, quarry, that sad soup wondering what landed you here. Was it talking back? Taking an extra second to eat? The Gulag's rules are a minefield, and you're learning that stepping out of line, even slightly, comes with a price. You pull your coat tighter, but it's no match for the cold gnawing at your bones. Speaking of bones, here's a joke. Why did the prisoner dread solitary? Because the cell was colder than a guard's heart. You smirk, but there's no one to hear it, just the echo of your own breath. You're starting to see why punishment cells were feared. They strip you of everything, even the crowded misery of the barracks. Time crawls, marked only by the drip of water and the ache in your limbs. Joking aside, if this cell's supposed to teach you a lesson, you're already missing that lice-infested bunk from last night. You curl up tighter, trying to conserve what little warmth you have, and brace for the long, lonely hours until they let you out or don't. You're back in the quarry, the pickaxe's weight dragging at your arms as you trudge through the snow, the faint warmth of that watery soup already a distant memory. The Gulag's air is sharp with pine and frost, and the clatter of tools mixes with the low grumble of prisoners too tired to talk. You're surrounded by a mix of faces, some hardened, some broken, each navigating the camp's unwritten rules of survival. This is the social hierarchy of the Gulag, a brutal pecking order where criminals, political prisoners, and everyone in between jostle for scraps, status, or just a chance to make it through the day. You're learning fast that who you stand next to could mean the difference between a crust of bread or a fist to the face. The Gulag's social structure was a complex web, shaped by desperation and power. Mainstream history tells us that in the 1930s and 1940s, camps were divided between politicals, intellectuals, dissidents, or anyone labelled an enemy of the state, and criminals, often thieves or gangsters who ruled through intimidation. You're a political, you think, judging by the way a burly guy with a scarred face eyes your boots like they're his next prize. He's one of the Urki, the criminal elite, who often got better rations or lighter work by cozying up to guards. You keep your head down, trying not to draw attention, but you're already sizing up who's friend, foe, or just trying to survive like you. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some criminals ran makeshift courts in the barracks, settling disputes with their own brutal justice, like a twisted version of a neighborhood watch. You overhear a guy whispering about a thief who lost his tobacco ration for stealing a spoon judge, jury, and fist all in one night. Historians still argue whether this hierarchy helped maintain order or just deepened the camp's misery, with some saying it gave prisoners a sense of control and others claiming it turned them against each other for the guards' benefit. You're leaning toward misery as you dodge the scarred guy's glare, clutching your pickaxe like it's your only ally. The quarry's a chaotic mix of prisoners, some swinging tools with grim focus, others slacking when the guards aren't looking. You notice a thin man, probably a political like you, muttering to himself as he works, maybe a professor or a poet, now reduced to breaking rocks. The criminals, meanwhile, strut like they own the place, barking orders at weaker prisoners to carry their load. You're starting to see how this hierarchy works. The strong prey on the weak, and the weak learn to blend in or barter. You think back to that Wild West saloon, where a pickle or a shot of moonshine could buy you a friend here. A crust of bread might cost you your dignity. Speaking of dignity, here's a joke. Why did the prisoner avoid the criminals? Because he didn't want to trade his soul for a soup spoon. You smirk, but the guy next to you doesn't notice. He's too busy dodging a rock kicked his way by an urki. The guards don't care about the pecking order, as long as the work gets done, their rifles glinting in the weak sunlight. You're learning to navigate this world, keeping your eyes low, but your senses sharp. The day's dragging on, and the cold seeping deeper into your bones. Joking aside, if surviving the quarry means surviving this hierarchy, you're already missing that sad lunch soup. You swing your pickaxe, the rhythm grounding you, and brace for whatever this camp's social jungle throws at you next. You're back on your splintered bunk, the needle from that risky trade tucked safely in your pocket, as the Gulag's night hums with the restless sounds of snoring and coughing prisoners. The air's thick with the smell of damp wood and unwashed bodies, and the cold seeps through the barracks walls like a thief. You're feeling a tickle in your throat, a dull ache in your joints, and your body's warning you that sickness is creeping in. In the Gulag, health was a fragile thing, and you're about to face the grim reality of surviving illness with no medicine, no warmth, and no mercy. You pull your thin coat tighter, hoping to shake off the chill, but the cough's stubborn, and you're starting to realize that staying healthy here is as much a battle as swinging a pickaxe. Healthcare in the Gulag was almost non-existent, a cruel afterthought in a system that valued labor over lives. Mainstream history tells us that in the 1930s and 1940s, medical care was limited to overcrowded, filthy infirmaries, staffed by overworked or indifferent doctors, often prisoners themselves. You're limping now, your cough worsening, and the thought of reporting to the infirmary feels like a gamble. It's a shack on the camp's edge, smelling of mold and despair, where you might get a bandage or a day off work if you're lucky. More likely, you'll be sent back to the quarry with a pat on the back and a warning not to slack off. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some prisoners swore by homemade remedies, like rubbing snow on frostbite or chewing pine needles for vitamins, desperate tricks to fend off scurvy or infection. You consider trying the pine needle trick, remembering that saloons' pickles those might have helped more than this camp's so-called cures. Historians still argue whether the lack of healthcare was deliberate neglect or a logistical failure, with some saying it was meant to weed out the weak and others claiming the system simply couldn't afford proper care. Your burning throat leans toward neglect as you cough again, hoping it's just a cold and not something worse. The barracks a grim stage for your growing sickness, with prisoners around you hacking and shivering, their own ailments ignored unless they collapse mid-shift. You're thinking about that Wild West saloon's chilly its heat might have burned this cough right out. Unlike the watery soup still sitting heavy in your gut, the guards don't care if you're sick, they just want you working. You notice a guy on the next bunk wrapping his feet in rags, probably fighting frostbite, and you wonder how long he'll last. The infirmary's a last resort going there means risking a label as a shirker, which could land you in that punishment cell again. Speaking of risks, here's a joke. Why did the prisoner avoid the infirmary? Because the only cure was a colder cell. You smirk, but the woman next to you doesn't notice she's too busy coughing into her sleeve. You're learning that health here is a luxury, like that letter you wrote, and you're clinging to both with fading strength. The night drags on, the cold making your aches worse, and you're dreading tomorrow's roll call. Joking aside, if a cough's enough to knock you down, you're already missing that black market needle eight might have stitched you together. You huddle under your thin blanket, trying to conserve warmth, and brace for a day where sickness and labor collide in this frozen, unforgiving camp. You're still huddled near that dying stove, the faint warmth and the echo of last night's story lingering like a fragile thread in the Gulag's relentless cold. The barracks air is thick with the smell of damp wood and restless bodies, but the morning's creeping in, signalled by the distant crunch of guards' boots outside. You're bone-tired, your cough worse, your body heavy from days of labour, hunger, and fleeting moments of hope. You're reflecting now, sitting on your bunk with that needle and button in your pocket, on how prisoners like you found ways to endure the Gulag's grind-through grit, small rebellions, and an unyielding will to survive. This is the final piece of the camp's daily life. A look at the resilience that kept spirits alive in a place built to break them. Survival in the Gulag was a testament to human endurance, a quiet defiance against a system that saw prisoners as tools, not people. Mainstream history tells us that in the 1930s and 1940s, millions survived the camps through cunning, camaraderie, and sheer stubbornness, despite starvation, cold, and brutality. You clutch your button thinking of home, and it's a tiny anchor, like the stories by the stove or that traded needle. You've seen prisoners barter, share tales, or carve notches in bunk-small acts that screamed, "I'm still here." You're part of that now, finding strength in the rhythm of roll call, work, and meager meals, even if each day feels like a battle you barely win. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some prisoners kept diaries on scraps of bark or cloth, scribbling thoughts to preserve their sanity, hiding them from guards who'd punish such defiance. You glance at your letter from earlier, tucked away, and wonder if it's your own diary, a record of a life the camp can't erase. Historians still argue whether survival was about individual grit or collective support, with some saying personal resilience carried prisoners through, and others claiming shared bonds like those stove-side stories made the difference. Your aching body, warmed by last night's fire, leans toward both you've needed every scrap of strength and every stolen moment of connection to keep going. The barracks stirring now, prisoners rising for another dawn roll call, their faces etched with the same weary determination you feel. You're thinking about that Wild West saloon's chiliot's fiery kick a world away from the watery soup here, but both fueled survival in their own harsh worlds. You're starting to see how resilience worked. A traded crust, a whispered story, a refusal to let the cold win. You notice a woman tying rags around her shoes, her hands steady despite the frost, and you're reminded that survival here is a daily choice. The guards' shouts are getting closer, and you know the quarry or forest awaits, another day of breaking rocks or your spirit. Speaking of spirit, here's a joke. Why did the prisoner keep going? Because giving up wasn't on the camp menu. You smirk, but the guy next to you doesn't notice. He's too busy pulling on his coat, ready for the cold. The barracks emptying out, and you're joining the shuffle, your cough a dull ache, but your steps firm. Joking aside, if survival's the only victory here, you're already missing that stove's fleeting warmth. You grip your button, a reminder of a world beyond the barbed wire, and head toward the roll call, ready to face another day in this frozen grind. You're standing in the snow, the roll call fading as the camp settles into its rhythm, the sky a soft grey that blurs the edges of the barbed wire. The cold's still there, but it's softer now, like a whisper instead of a shout, and your breath curls in the air like a quiet promise. You've carried that button, that needle, those stories through the quarry, the hunger, the long nights, and they've held you together, stitch by stitch. The Gulag's noise boots, shouts, the clink of tools fades into a gentle hum, like a fan you left on back home. Let the weight of the day slip away, like snow melting in spring, and feel your shoulders loosen, your mind drift. You're here, you're whole, and that's enough. Close your eyes, let the cold dissolve, and sink into a calm, dreamless sleep.